I have read numerous comments left on my last two videos suggesting that term limits are needed to reform the way Congress operates and to make them more accountable to voters. In this video, I am going to share my thoughts on term limits. I am Dr. John Padfield, an engineer turned state representative turned business professor, and this is Business Reform, where we discuss issues at the intersection of business, technology, and society. When I first came up with my channel name and tagline, I was focused on issues such as privacy, business ethics, social media, business trends, and censorship. While this channel has and will continue to discuss all of those topics, I have also started to incorporate some nonpartisan videos on government because government policy, such as banning TikTok, is often the single biggest factor influencing business, technology, and society. Before getting into a discussion of whether we should implement term limits, I want to provide some context about the history of term limits. The U.S. Constitution, as written in 1781, did not include term limits for any elected office. President George Washington set a precedent by refusing to run for a third term in 1796, and every subsequent president followed that precedent until Franklin D. Roosevelt, who ran for and won a third term in 1940 and a fourth term in 1944. This prompted Congress to write the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which they passed in 1947 and sent to the states for ratification. By 1951, 3/4 of the states had ratified the amendment, and U.S. presidents have been limited to 2 terms ever since. Congress amended the U.S. Constitution to limit a president to just 2 terms in office, but for some strange reason, they didn't think it was necessary to limit the number of terms they could serve in office. So how long do members of Congress serve on average? To answer that question, I went to the Congressional Research Service and found a 2010 report that shows the average years of service for members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate from the first Congress elected in 1788 through the 111th Congress, which was elected in 2008. In 1788, when the first Congress was elected, the average number of years they had been in office was unsurprisingly 0. For the first 110 years of Congress, 1788 through 1898, the average years of service for members of the House remained below 4 years, meaning on average, members of Congress served less than 2 terms. However, in 1900, for the first time, the average tenure of members of Congress reached 4 years, and over the next 108 years, the average increased to 10 years. You may be thinking 10 years doesn't sound like all that long, but keep in mind these are averages, and members of Congress in leadership positions, who essentially have all the power, tend to stay in office much longer than average. How much longer? There are 8 members of the House and Senate who have served over half a century in federal office. Democrat Congressman John Dingell from Michigan holds the record for serving over 59 years in Congress before retiring, while Democrat Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia served 57 years before passing away in office. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa is the only currently serving member who has been in office over 50 years. For anyone wondering, Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer has been in the House or Senate for 44 years. Mitch McConnell, the former Senate Republican leader who is still in the Senate, has been there for over 40 years, and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who is also still a representative, has been in the House for over 37 years. As always, links to all of my sources can be found in the description of this video. According to a September 2023 poll conducted by Pew Research, 87% of Americans support limiting the number of terms members of Congress can serve, while only 12% of Americans oppose term limits for members of Congress. So with that context, I want to move to discussing what problem do we have that we think term limits will solve. In other words, as I used to frequently ask my colleagues in the Indiana House, is this a solution in search of a problem? Here are 5 common benefits many people expect to come from implementing term limits. The first and most obvious benefit is term limits would eliminate career politicians. Most people agree that would be a good thing, especially when we have recently had members of the House and Senate who have been in office for decades and who either moved into a nursing home while still in office or ceded power of attorney to their daughter to handle their legal and financial matters for them while they remained in office voting on legal and financial matters for the entire country. Another benefit of term limits is it would reduce the built-in advantage that incumbents have in getting re-elected. This advantage is based on the advantage incumbents have in being able to get free media coverage, raise money from lobbyists, and the advantage they have in name recognition among voters. In 1992, Eddie Murphy starred in a movie called The Distinguished Gentleman. The premise of the movie is that Eddie Murphy was a con man who shared the same name as a long-term incumbent congressman from Florida. When the congressman passed away shortly before the election, Eddie Murphy ran for Congress as a third-party candidate and got elected based purely on name recognition. The movie is extremely funny and not funny at all at the same time, because it illustrates a very real problem in our current political system. Other anticipated benefits of term limits include facilitating new and most likely younger members of Congress coming in with fresh ideas and perspectives. Term limits are also expected to make members of Congress more responsive to voters because they would not have time to build up their name recognition to the point where re-election is almost guaranteed. And finally, term limits are often viewed as a way to reduce corruption and improve public trust. As I pointed out in my last video, over the past 55 years, 72 members of the U.S. House and Senate have been convicted for crimes committed while in office. I can only imagine how many more were guilty but did not get convicted. That is not an exhaustive list of all the benefits, but those are what I would consider to be the 5 best reasons to enact term limits. But we also need to examine potential unintended consequences from term limits, then decide, do the benefits outweigh the risk? The first unintended consequence I see is that when a politician is term limited in Congress, they are likely to move from elected office to either working for a federal regulatory agency or lobbying. Under today's rules, representatives who leave office only need to wait 1 year before becoming a lobbyist, and senators only need to wait 2 years before becoming a lobbyist. This could create a revolving door of recent members of Congress becoming highly effective lobbyists due to their network of relationships with former colleagues. Another unintended consequence is that term limits might shift more power to congressional staff members and lobbyists. Think of an iceberg. About 10% of the iceberg is visible above the waterline, while 90% is hidden below the waterline. Now think of an elected member of the House or Senate as the visible part above the waterline. When they are in their last term, they will likely endorse someone to take their place, who, if elected, will likely keep a lot of the staff of the existing member. The power doesn't go away, it just gets pushed below the surface where it is harder to see and hold anyone accountable. Another potential unintended consequence is that despite some people thinking term limits will make elected officials more responsive, it may have the exact opposite effect during their last term in office. There is a well-known phenomenon first studied in the military among soldiers approaching the end of their tour of duty. The phenomenon is called short-timer syndrome, and it is defined as a drop in morale, rise in anxiety, and a withdrawal from commitment. I could easily see an elected official who knows that they are term limited, not putting in nearly as much effort and not being very responsive toward the end of their time in office. While opponents to term limits may make many additional arguments, I personally feel a lot of the objections are weak. I will conclude my list with what I consider the 4th strong argument against term limits, and that is that they limit voters who genuinely like and want to keep someone in office they believe is doing a good job. I personally have a very short list of senators and members of Congress who I have donated to because I felt they were doing a great job. A couple of them I later regretted donating to, but that's beside the point. I have tremendous respect for Senator Rand Paul, and I would hate to lose him from the Senate over term limits. But again, I recognize he is the exception, not the rule. So where do I come down on term limits? While I do support them, I am not an enthusiastic advocate for them because I personally don't think they will make near as big of a difference as many people believe they will. Are there alternatives to term limits? Absolutely. Let's quickly look at a couple of them. First, some people want maximum age limits on elected officials. In fact, the same Pew Research Poll that found 87% of Americans support term limits for Congress found 79% of Americans support maximum age limits for elected officials. I am not a part of that 79%. I personally know people in their late 80s who are cognitively still at the top of their game. And likewise, I know people that are in their early 60s who are already cognitively struggling. I believe there is simply too much variation from person to person to simply draw a line in the sand and say you can't hold office if you are over a certain age. Another idea I have heard proposed is giving cognitive tests to candidates. I fully support this idea, but only if I am the one who gets to write and grade the test. Just kidding. Sort of. Between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, some states implemented literacy tests to ensure people who showed up to vote could read and write before they cast their vote. These tests were nothing more than thinly disguised attempts to prevent certain people from being able to vote. My concern with giving cognitive tests to candidates is that they would quickly become highly politicized and would have less to do with assessing cognitive function and more to do with preventing certain people with certain beliefs from being able to run for office. I could easily imagine such a test including questions such as how many genders are there and what is the leading cause of climate change. Maximum age limits and cognitive tests for candidates are two ideas that have been discussed for a while, but I want to wrap up this video with two of my own ideas. First, I would suggest we repeal the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Many people do not realize it, but the U.S. Constitution, as written in 1781, had the state legislatures in each state selecting their 2 U.S. senators for their state. This makes sense. The purpose of the House of Representatives is to represent the people, and that is why the number of representatives from each state is based on the population of that state. Today, the states of Wyoming, Vermont, South Dakota, North Dakota, Delaware, and Alaska each have just one representative, while California has 52 representatives. Again, that is because the House of Representatives represents the people. However, every state, regardless of population, has 2 senators. That is because the Senate is supposed to represent the states. Originally, the state legislatures elected their senators based on who they thought would do the best job representing their state, but the 17th Amendment essentially turned the U.S. Senate into a more exclusive version of the U.S. House. I would like to see the United States go back to the founders' original intent on this subject. But what I really see as the best alternative to term limits is eternal vigilance. If you look online, you will find many minor variations of this quote attributed to many different people, including Thomas Jefferson, Margaret Thatcher, and Stuart Brand. There is no official record of Thomas Jefferson having ever said, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty," although it certainly sounds like something that he would have said. But my favorite version of the quote has been traced back to an Irish judge who in 1790 said in a written speech, "It is the common fate of the indolent to see their rights become a prey to the active. The condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance, which condition if he break, servitude is at once the consequence of his crime and the punishment of his guilt." I sincerely believe the best form of election reform is an informed and engaged electorate who hold their elected officials accountable by watching them closely and supporting the ones who are upholding their oaths of office. But what do you think? Where do you stand on term limits? What other ideas do you have to improve our electoral system? I look forward to reading your comments.